Text Talks.
Hi everyone, welcome to this week's episode of Text Talks. Today's mini lecture is on Buddhist meditation. There are two things I want to emphasize in today's lecture. One is the importance of meditation within the Buddhist tradition. And secondly, I want to emphasize the variety of methods of meditation throughout the Buddhist tradition. As you should know by now, each of these mini lectures is accompanied by a PowerPoint presentation. So if you're looking at your PowerPoints now, I suggest that you look at slide number 2. Now, what I have here on slide number 2 is a quotation for the Mahapadana Sutta. For those of you who've been following the earlier lectures, you might remember that this sutta is depicting the sort of ideal life of a Buddha. And one of the things here that we see from this passage is the description of the Buddha's enlightenment. It says here, when the Bodhisattva had entered this dwelling alone in a secluded spot, he thought, and then, the quotation is basically talking about the doctrine of dependent origination. One of the reasons why I picked out this passage here is to remind us that the Buddha's enlightenment comes from an insight that he makes while meditating. And so in that sense, I think that it really brings home the centrality of meditation to the Buddhist tradition, that the Buddha became enlightened through a meditational experience. And in fact, certainly within the first several hundred years of Buddhism, the insight that he came upon during meditation, dependent origination, was thought of as the central teaching of early Buddhism, as the teaching that basically depicted his meditational experience itself. Now, not only was the Buddha's first enlightenment depicted as a sort of product or induced by meditation, but we also see that the Buddha's final nirvana, the nirvana he achieves when he passes away from this earth, is achieved when he's in a meditational state. Here we're reminded in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, and you can be looking at slide number 3, that this sutta, which basically has an account of his last days, his final journey, his final words, but also as the title of the sutta tells us, his final nibbana. And here, as the text describes it, the Buddha, while lying on his side, passes through 8 levels of meditational trance. He passes through them again backwards. Then when he reaches the 4th level again, he finally passes away. So in other words, the Buddha achieves his final enlightenment while meditating. So I think that these passages remind us of how central meditation is to Buddhism as a whole. Now, if we want to look at the types of meditation in Theravada Buddhism, now focusing particularly on Theravada Buddhism, and now we're on slide number 4, basically there are 2 types of meditation that we see today that basically claim to have their origins in the early texts. Now, one of the things is both these terms, samatha and vipassana, are used in the early texts, but on the other hand, in the early sources, they're not necessarily 2 different types of meditation, but 2 techniques that are used, while the same person would be meditating. So samatha basically refers to focusing on a visual or real object, particularly something like a candle. The idea is that this calms the mind. And within the several stages of a meditational trance, this is the first, or the first few stages. It's just calming the mind in the first place. Vipassana refers more directly to meditating on the Buddha's teachings. So we might say that this is more kind of conceptual in a way. Now, on this slide, I also point out that one of the most important branches of Buddhist philosophy, the Abhidharma philosophy, increasingly became an attempt to recreate the mental state of the Buddha when he achieved enlightenment. So we can see that the practice of meditation is not only associated with being a Buddhist practice, but is also closely related to Buddhist philosophy. Now, one of the texts that I brought attention to in previous text talks, mini lectures, has been the Mahasatipatthana Sutta. And one of the reasons I brought attention to this text is because so many of the core teachings of early Buddhism appear in this sutta. I've outlined some of them in slide number 5. But looking at slide number 6, I want to bring up a very graphic description of Buddhist meditation. And this is the famous meditation to perform on the cremation grounds. Here, the Buddha is saying, again, a monk, if he were to see a corpse thrown aside on a charnel ground, 1, 2, or 3 days dead, bloated, discolored, festering, compares his body with that, thinking this body is the same nature. It will become like that. It is not exempt from that fate. So he abides contemplating body as body, internally and externally, and he abides independent, not clinging to anything in the world. And that, monks, is how a monk abides contemplating body as body. Again, a monk, if he were to see a corpse in a charnel ground, thrown aside, eaten by crows, hawks, and vultures, by dogs or jackals, or various other creatures. Again, a monk, as if he were to see a corpse in a charnel ground, thrown aside, a skeleton with flesh and blood, connected by sinews, the skeleton attached from the flesh and blood connected by sinews. Even later, randomly connected bones scattered in all directions. A hand bone here, a foot bone there, a shin bone here, a thigh bone here, a hip bone here, a spine bone here, a skull there. Again, a monk, if he were to see a corpse in a charnel ground thrown aside, the bones whitened, looking like shells. Or even later, the bones piled up, a year old, the bones rotted away to a powder. If he compares this body with that, thinking this body is the same nature, will become like that, is not exempt from that fate. So here we see this very stark and sobering description of a meditation exercise in which a monk is supposed to be looking around at what he sees in a cremation grounds, and to see that either the recent corpse that have been put there, or the ones that have been there for a long time, that where the bones are reduced to powder, all of these remains are made up of the same nature as one's own body. And so in this way, we can see this whole exercise as a meditation on impermanence and on anatta, that there's no essence here, that the physical body merely decays. Okay, so there's, here we see a very stark and sobering meditation exercise. Now let's skip ahead a few hundred years to the beginning of Mahayana Buddhism. And here we're looking at slide 8, one of the things that Mahayana Buddhism is known for is iconographic visualizations of a Buddha. So, for example, people would meditate on a well-known image of a Buddha, and in some cases even meditate as if they were facing that Buddha, meditate as if that Buddha, they were meditating along with a meditating Buddha who was facing them. This sort of visualization is also seen in Tibetan Buddhism. I think you might have seen some of these diagrams, these yantras, which in some cases are meant to be seen as visual tools that can help one center oneself during meditation. And so there are some traditions where a monk who is meditating is meant to visually recreate every detail in one of these diagrams. So already we can see here by looking at some early examples of Theravada meditation, and here some examples of Mahayana meditation, that meditation styles vary. That there's a lot of different types of meditation in the history of Buddhism. I just want to finish up by talking more specifically about a type of meditation we find in Zen Buddhism. Now, first of all, so now we're starting on slide number 10. And first of all, it's important to remind ourselves that meditation is important in most schools of Buddhism. However, with the emergence of the Chan school, and Chan is the Chinese name for a school of Buddhism that, when it went to Japan, would be known as the Zen school. But Chan itself is a Chinese translation or attempt to transliterate the Sanskrit term dhyana, which means meditation. It's one of the deep stages of meditation that's described in the early sources. So in other words, the Zen school basically kind of identifies itself as the meditation school. So that word Zen is a Japanese word for a Chinese word for a Sanskrit word that means meditation. On the one hand, I think that the Zen school perhaps exaggerates the importance of meditation in its own school as compared to other schools, because as we've seen, meditation was a part of a lot of, it's been an important part of Buddhism all the way through. But on the other hand, it's very interesting to look at some of the ways in which meditation is represented within the Zen schools, and it gives us some of our most memorable descriptions of meditation in the Buddhist tradition. So first of all, according to legend, the Chan school was founded by a monk by the name of Bodhidharma, and Bodhidharma was from South India, and had basically traveled to China and started his own school there. And Bodhidharma himself is known as a great meditator. And in fact, according to the story, he spent the final 9 years of his life in meditation, gazing at a wall until his legs fell off. So that this might seem like a rather gruesome story, but I think the take-home message here is that he didn't even notice. He was in such a deep state of meditation that his legs were completely unimportant to him. And while Bodhidharma was meditating in front of the wall, a monk named Shen Kuang approached him and asked to hear the Chan teachings. Bodhidharma did not pay any attention to him until the monk cut off his arm to prove his sincerity. And again, we see, this sort of, motif throughout Zen Buddhism that, this is, first of all, a sort of sacrifice that's worth it for a Buddhist teaching, and secondly, that those most adept at Buddhist meditation, would barely feel the pain. The reason, though, I want to bring to your attention the Zen school, and now we're looking at slide 12, is that it has introduced a very unique type of meditation, and this is based on the koan. So first of all, it's important to know that there are two different schools of Zen Buddhism. One is the Rinzai school, which we're talking about here, and one is the Soto school. And I'll just say from the outset, it's the Rinzai school that focuses on the koan, and as we'll see in a moment, the Soto school does not. Now, so the most characteristic feature of the Rinzai school was its reliance on this type of meditation based around a koan. And a koan is a short saying or a riddle that is meant to serve as a tool for achieving enlightenment. And the koan can appear as a conversation, a strange happening, a paradoxical saying. And the procedure of a Zen koan is that a teacher will give the student a koan to think about, and then the student will think about that koan while meditating, and then later report back to his teacher or his master, what sort of insights he made while thinking about that koan. Now, I've spent quite a bit of time in Japan over the years, and I've actually heard different accounts from different Buddhists about how a koan is used. I'm guessing that both of these are right, but they're just used by different monasteries in different ways. According to one account, basically a Buddhist monk will be given a koan to think about for a while, and then have a weekly meeting with his master to talk about how he's thinking about this koan. But at some point, the teacher will then say, okay, you're ready for another koan. And then, the Buddhist monk will be thinking about that for a while, whether that's several weeks or several months or several years. But that basically, during the life of any given Buddhist monk, they will have basically reflected on several different koans along the way. But I've also heard that, according to some, I've also heard that in some monasteries that a Buddhist monk will be just given one koan for their entire, rest of their life, and it'll be that koan that they're meant to be reflecting upon every time they're meditating. So just a little bit more about what a koan is, and then I'll give you some examples. Here we have a famous Buddhist scholar saying, the use of koan is a unique phenomenon in the history of religion. Nothing like it exists in other religious traditions. It developed in China. Koans testified to an authentically Chinese mentality, particularly in the way they are rooted in real life. If Zen can be called the Chinese expression of Buddhism, then koans are the most Chinese expression of Zen. Okay, so now let's look at slide number 13. As I said, koans can be a riddle, they can be a surprising phrase, and it's also interesting to know that the translation of koan is case, as in like a court case. So we might think of koans also being sort of a dilemma or a challenge, a case to be considered. So some of the most famous koans are, what did your face look like before you were born? Or what is the sound of one hand clapping? Or we get these sort of very short dialogues that leave you sort of, without knowing what's really going on. A monk asks Zhao Zu, does a dog have the Buddha nature? Zhao Zu answered, no. Or a monk asked Dong Shan, what is Buddha? Dong Shan replied, 3 pounds of hemp. Or then a famous one, Aiswin told his disciple, kill everything that stands in your way. If you should meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha. If you should meet the patriarchs, kill the patriarchs. If you should meet the monks on your way, kill them too. So, one of the things that these koans are meant to be is they're meant to be provocative, mysterious, challenging. But then on the other hand, we might see that sometimes we can make more sense out of them than others. What did your face look like before you were born? As far as I'm concerned, that koan remains rather unexplained. That's something, you can imagine somebody having that koan for their whole life and thinking about that in all sorts of new ways as they reach different stages in their life. However, the last one on this slide, kill everything that stands in your way. If you should meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha. On the one hand, that might seem very provocative. It might even seem like, that this is, heresy. But on the other hand, I think that we can make sense out of this koan by saying that basically, according to the Zen tradition, or according to Buddhism more generally, we cannot be attached. If we cannot be, attached to the Buddha, we can't be attached to the Buddha's teaching, that, if we really want to understand the deeper insight of being non-attached, if we start revering the Buddha too much, if we're memorizing the teaching but not thinking about what they mean, that these are actually getting in the way towards our spiritual progress. And so I think that this koan perhaps, isn't as kind of mysterious because, as provocative as it is, we can make more sense out of it. Now, in slide 14, I'm bringing your attention to a Buddhist text called the Mumonkan, which is basically translated as the Gateless Gate. This is a text that's widely available now. You can even look at it online, and I have some links at the end of this slideshow. And this is a collection of 48 koans. It was collected in about 1200 CE. And these are some of the most well-known Buddhist koans in Japan. And I'd certainly recommend having a look at these if you're interested. So here's another one, for example. A monk asked Joshu, I have just entered the monastery. Please teach me. Joshu asked, have you eaten your rice porridge? The monk replied, I have eaten. Joshu says, then you had better wash your bowl. At that moment, the monk was enlightened. And so here we see another sort of theme that we find in a number of koans, that the Dharma, that the Buddhist teachings are taught through actions more than words. And also they're taught in rather unexpected ways, rather than the more obvious ways. I have, a few more examples on slide number 15. I'll let you look at those on your own. But in the last slide, I just want to bring attention to the fact that there's another school of Buddhism in Japan, of Zen Buddhism, called the Soto school. And for the Soto school, they completely rejected the idea of koan. So even within Zen Buddhism, not all Zen Buddhists use koans as a sort of instrument of meditation. But what's interesting is the Soto school places just as much importance on meditation as a practice. And according to the Soto school, there's no there's no sort of shortcut to being enlightened. So there's no saying that can just sort of spark this insight. But rather, according to the Soto school and its founder, Dogen, that basically enlightenment is just sitting and doing meditation. That one, that basically being focused on enlightenment is a problem. That the best thing to do is to just sit quietly. And so Zazen is basically known as a very austere practice where meditation is not seen as a method to attain enlightenment, but rather just seen as a practice that is good in its own right. As Dogen said, sitting fixedly, think of not thinking. How do you think of not thinking? Non-thinking. This is the art of Zazen. Okay, so I have two more slides that basically give you some primary source, that gives you some primary sources to look at and secondary sources to sort of supplement this lecture. And anyway, I hope that you can see that meditation is both a central aspect of Buddhist practice, but also a practice that has had quite a bit of variety through the years. I also hope you enjoy looking at some of these Zen koans. Okay, thank you very much.